Hello, everyone, and welcome to Gehenna Gaming Interviews, Special Edition. Today's guest likely needs no introduction, but we're going to sing his praises anyway. You cannot crack open a horror RPG sourcebook or supplement these days without seeing the name Matthew Dawkins. Some of you may know him as the Gentleman Gamer, a prolific writer, game developer, game master, and content creator. His work spans across Kult, Divinity Lost, Chronicles of Darkness, Call of Cthulhu, Vampire the Masquerade, for which he's won 2 Origins Awards, Fan Favorite RPG of the Year and Best Role-Playing Game of the Year, 2019. And his original game line, They Came From Beneath the Sea, as well as many, many other games that we could probably spend most of this stream just listing off. So most recently, you can hear him on Red Moon Roleplaying as the guest GM running the scenario The Summit, which he also wrote for the Cult supplement Teraticum and Other Stories, which I never know if I'm pronouncing Teraticum correctly, so...
That's how I pronounce it.
Excellent. We at Gehenna Gaming are huge fans of the work that he has done across all of these game lines, and we are very excited about the release of Mummy 2nd Edition as well, which has already doubled its pledge goal on Kickstarter. But it only has 11 days left to back, so hurry over there today after the stream, not during, and make sure you back it. We could probably spend the rest of the episode, as I said, just listing and describing all of Matthew Dawkins' work, but today we are honored to have him here with us, so thank you for joining us, sir.
That's my pleasure, and by all means, if you want to keep listing things I've worked on, it'll be a very easy interview for me. And I know you just said to your wonderful viewers and listeners to back Mummy after the stream, but I don't mind if you want to go over to check out Mummy the Curse 2nd Edition on Kickstarter right now, because we are so close. We are a hair's breadth away from the first source book being funded, so any support anyone can lend will be gratefully appreciated. And by all means, post in the Twitch chat if you do, because I'll shout out and sing your praises. I will even sing a song for you.
And
I will.
To that end, I just dropped a link to it in the chat for you. So
thank you.
I'm gonna get us kicked off right now. As we've said several times now, you are arguably one of the most prolific writers and game designers in the horror tabletop industry at this time. When do you actually find time to sleep? And more importantly, what projects do you have in the works currently?
Well, I don't sleep. That's the thing. No, I don't blink. Some people have noticed that I very rarely blink when I start doing the Gentleman Gamer thing. And now you're going to be looking in my eyes, waiting for me to blink. We'll just be staring each other out in this way, and you won't win, sir. I guarantee you won't win. So when do I sleep? To be honest, it's become a lot easier since writing role-playing games became my full-time career. When I was doing this in evenings and weekends and working as a trainer during the day, during the week, it was far more difficult to do. And yeah, I certainly was running on empty a lot then. And to be honest, I still work a lot of evenings now. I'm doing this interview in the evening. I do most interviews in the evening because I'm being interviewed by American podcasts and Twitch streams, and that's all fine. I don't mind. I'm just very fortunate in that I can sometimes sleep in a bit longer, and I somehow manage to balance work and life and leisure and being a dad and everything else, and it seems to be going all right. And what else? What am I working on right now? I am, you know what, I am back. I'm getting back into the YouTubing in a big way. I just started the Gentleman's Guide to Scion on my YouTube channel. It's been a while since that's had a lot of content added, and there's already a lot of videos lined up ready to be uploaded there. I am overseeing the Mummy the Curse 2nd Edition Kickstarter in a lot of ways, at least in terms of the development of the manuscript, because we're getting a lot of feedback, and that sometimes requires us to make some tweaks, some amendments, or at least review our content. So that takes quite a lot of time. In terms of writing, I am writing on a strictly unannounced project that will be announced at some point next year, I suspect. That's a very exciting one. I wish I could tell you what it is, but it's for a game you do not know about at this time. In terms of World of Darkness, Cult of the Blood Gods manuscript is approved. It's ready to go. So again, once that goes up on Kickstarter, we will have the same process of viewers leaving feedback or backers leaving feedback and us making amendments to it if necessary, if possible. The amendments process on World of Darkness projects is a lot stricter, I should say, than other lines. But other games that I am working on, I am developing the wrestling RPG for Aberrant, so for the Trinity Continuum. That's going to be getting started soon. And we've also got, I nearly let slip something that I shouldn't have.
Oh, damn.
I'll tell you what, though, I am developing the They Came From Beneath the Sea source books up to a state of completion.
Excellent.
And reviewing art that's coming in for V5's Let the Streets Run Red, V5 Chicago folios, because all of that's now coming in and those books are getting put together. So yeah, there's a lot on my plate, and that's just from Onyx Path. Otherwise, there's also... You probably weren't expecting an answer that quite this long.
I kind of was, I won't lie.
Okay.
We can say you're the most prolific writer.
So I'm in the very tail end of developing work for a game called Solemn Veil. Solemn Veil is a role-playing game by a company by the name of Dirty Vortex, which is Mark Kelly's company. Mark Kelly is a quite prolific artist, in fact, in the RPG industry right now. And Solemn Veil is a game of folk horror, British folk horror specifically. So Wicker Man, lots of Ben Wheatley style films as well, The Kill List, that sort of thing, Field in England. Yeah, so that one's a very creepy horror game that's coming out too.
I just remember to ask you more about that one. I'm a particularly large fan of folk horror.
Fantastic. And I just finished writing a scenario for Cult Divinity Lost as well, for an upcoming project. So yeah, that's the things off the top of my head.
Fantastic.
And now I will blink. There we go.
You have to time them between questions.
Well, I have to occasionally pretend to be human.
I do know you just finished working on a scenario for Call of Cthulhu 7th edition as well, didn't you? I believe it's the current organized play you can do.
Yes, I did. Now, I don't know what the status is in terms of release for the Call of Cthulhu organized play. I sent that one off into the wild quite a while ago now, and as far as I recall, I've been paid for it. It's all done. But I wrote a nice traditional Deep Ones in Innsmouth Call of Cthulhu scenario, and it's got a chase in it, it's got a creepy family, it's got the reading of a will, it has people being kidnapped by Deep Ones, it has everything you could really want to have an Innsmouth Deep One based scenario, with Father Dagon and Mother Hydra, of course, in the background, as they like to be. So yeah, that was fun. It's been a while since I've written anything Call of Cthulhu, but I do enjoy it a great deal. It's one of the first horror role-playing games I ever played, so I've got a lot of attachment to that game.
Excellent. So one of the reasons that we invited you here was to specifically talk about Mummy. What can you tell us about Mummy 2nd edition? What has changed from 1st edition, and what can people look forward to with this Kickstarter?
Well, so I'm going to approach this from a different angle, because I think a lot of the people watching, a lot of the fans will already know what the basics of Mummy are, and if they don't, they can definitely find it out on the Kickstarter, which is running right now. One thing that has changed from 1st edition to 2nd edition, though, and I think the thing that really requires some emphasis from a setting perspective and a rules perspective, is the timeless aspect of it. This was something that wasn't really present in first edition, and the general idea of Mummy is that you wake up, you are active, you fall asleep for so many years, maybe centuries, you wake up again, you're active, you fall asleep. In second edition, that still happens, but you don't necessarily wake up in a chronologically linear order. So you could wake up in 1666, participate in the Great Fire of London, and maybe start it and descend. Next time you wake up could be 400 years before, 1,000 years before, it could be 400 years later. And so you basically exist as a timeless consciousness that can be planted into your body at any point along the timeline. It allows you to play around with time travel in a sort of lost or fringe way, or even a bit of a quantum leap way, because each time you end up jumping into a new body, you don't necessarily know where you are, when you are, or who you are, but you will gradually find that kind of thing out with your cultists surrounding you, and you don't necessarily have to look like Scott Bakula, but you can. You could if you wanted, and you can do it with lots of other mummies as well. You can all be jumping backwards and forwards in time. And while that adds a sci-fi element to Mummy the Curse, it also adds a deeper level of mystery to it. One of the things I really love about Mummy, and the same goes for Mage the Awakening second edition, is they are both games about mysteries. And I have always had great success as a GM running games that are mysteries. It's what part of the reason I love Call of Cthulhu. Again, my players really seem to love that moment of when they realize something, when they uncover the truth. And from the very first time I ran Mummy the Curse, first edition, when I first received the hardcover book, in fact, after the Kickstarter, I ran this fantastic story set in during the third Sothic turn, during the Constantinople 6th century CE, and there was a big mystery behind who they were fighting, and when they got to the end of it, and by the time that it was due to descend, they had unlocked pretty much every mystery and just started opening up new ones before they had to sleep again. And I just love a good puzzle in a game, so to be able to add a bit of time travel into that so that you can actually start affecting your own fate, start affecting the fates of your cultists, the people you love, and the environment around you, was really appealing to me. I love horror mysteries, everything from Agatha Christie to the Cthulhu version of Horror on the Orient Express. Those sorts of things are really, really fun for me. So yeah, time travel in Mummy, it makes perfect sense when you read about it.
Fantastic. My immediate thought when I first started was this quantum leap. So it's definitely definitely a unique take on a Chronicles of Darkness game that people may not think about, but a new element that could be very fun to incorporate into other.
Yeah, I think there's a lovely part of horror to time travel, not just in the I don't know where I am confusion, but in the sometimes what will feel like futility of your position. And you get this in a lot of TV shows that handle time travel, specifically not Quantum Leap, because that's all about changing a small element of the past, usually. In Lost, for instance, or even The Time Machine, I guess, H.G. Wells, the idea that you can move forward or backward in time, and you can try altering the state of things, and then the next time you jump you can see what the outcome is, and the outcome is either not what you planned and is significantly worse, or you can't discern, at least immediately, that anything you did had any change at all. And so that can start affecting your characters in a very fundamental way. They can either think, my life is pointless, that may not sound like fun, or they might really start digging and find out, well, what happened after I did this? And they'll either observe how fate course corrects itself, and you either become a slave to fate, or you are going to constantly be fighting a losing battle. Or you will find out that your actions did have positive effects for the people around you, but you could not have foreseen that 1,000 years later the outcome would be X or Y. So I don't know. I think it's the game in the Chronicles of Darkness that time travel oddly lends itself most to, because you are playing immortals. You will always be immortal. There is no final death for mummies. You will always be slaves, and that's tragic. And just to really hammer that point home, it doesn't matter how far forward in time or how far backward in time you travel, you will always be slaves to the judges, your gods. So yeah, I think that's it's not necessarily fun in the strictest sense of the word, but it's certainly interesting.
Certainly sounds fun to me. Excellent. So that said, and with all of the other projects that you mentioned are involved with or actively working on or have most recently wrapped, from a industry standpoint and just from a writer designer standpoint, how do you stay sane jumping between not even just different settings within, say, Chronicles of Darkness and World of Darkness, but different game systems, like going from a storyteller system to the apocalypse, the cult system?
Yeah.
Do you structure your workday where you only work on one game at a time, or do you do you just find it very easy to bounce between?
I do generally work on one game per day if I'm writing. And what that means is I either absolutely fill up my day just constantly trying to be creative, or if I'm very lucky, I might conclude an assignment by 10 a.m. and then I can take the rest of the day off. And that may sound lazy, but generally I will just work and work and work and work until I get to that point. In terms of balancing system knowledge, that can definitely be a challenge. Not so much when you're jumping from company to company, because if I'm doing something for Helmgast for Cult Divinity Lost, and I'm doing something for Chaosium for Call of Cthulhu, and then Onyx Path for Chronicles of Darkness, those systems are all incredibly distinct, so I can kind of reset and adapt to those. But if I'm working on storyteller, storytelling, and story path systems, which are the three World of Darkness, Chronicles of Darkness, and the story path games like Scion, They Came From Beneath the Sea, Dystopia Rising, I wouldn't say I struggle, but I certainly made mistakes, because sometimes it's very difficult to remember, is this the game, to take a very easy example, I guess, is this the game where 8 is the threshold for success, or is it 6 in this one? Is this a game where I can adjust target numbers, or whether it's, or, this, that, or the other? It usually gets a little more granular than that. So, for instance, some games have a persuasion skill. Some games do not have a persuasion skill. One of my most hated abilities in the 20th anniversary and prior lines was, for Vampire, World of Darkness and such, was expression. Because everyone knows that you're going to pair expression with manipulation to try and convince someone to do something. But clearly a game designer, probably someone I still work with, and so I can understand why they did it. They probably thought, persuasion is just going to become too powerful. If we put persuasion in there, everyone's going to just use it. Then no one's going to use intimidate. No one's going to use subterfuge. They'll just use persuasion. So they put expression in. And other games, like in Story Path, do have persuasion. So I might be writing something for World of Darkness, for instance, if it was 20th anniversary, and I say, this requires a manipulation plus persuasion roll in brackets difficulty 3. And then, of course, I'll get my red lines back, or I'll have to develop it, or the editor will point out this skill doesn't exist in this edition. And then you just think, shit, because you've spent so long working on other game systems. So yeah, there's definitely some crossover, and it's not always easy to pull the two apart. I would say the most difficult is with storytelling, so that's Chronicles of Darkness and Story Path, because both have the number 8 as their difficulty level. Both have conditions, although Story Path to a much more limited degree than Chronicles of Darkness. And yeah, there's some similarities. Story Path is a lot more narrative friendly, I would say, than Chronicles of Darkness, but it's easy to get the two mixed up, I would say.
Makes sense. That makes complete sense. I know that as a storyteller, I've had a lot of trouble with alertness versus awareness.
Oh yeah,
V20 and V5.
And the fact there's no perception attribute as well, because in V5, and this is something all my writers, almost every single writer who has worked for me on a V5 book has at some point, if they're writing a chronicle, a story for you to play through, will say make a perception plus awareness roll. And yeah, perception's just not in there anymore. I think you're probably looking for wits in this case. But it's so easy to do. And yeah, if it's difficult for the storytellers, it's difficult for the writers, and you just have to be on your game when you're developing this work, and the editors have to be on their game when they're editing this work to look out for these rules, specificities.
Absolutely. From a less mechanical standpoint, do you find that you draw inspiration between different scenarios you're working on? So if you're working on a scenario for Kult, do you suddenly go, oh, that might work better in Vampire, or vice versa?
Yeah, and to be honest, I'm not shy about saying I have stolen ideas from some of my work to put in other work. Sometimes it's something as simple as to take a couple of actual plays as an example. Way back when, on my channel, I ran a Cthulhu by Gaslight scenario, I think. And one of the parts of that scenario had all the investigators visiting an asylum. They were all top of their professions, psychologists or varying degrees of charlatanry, and they were invited to this new asylum in the middle of bloody nowhere, because of course, and had to be introduced to each of the patients. And one of the patients was kind of existing half in and out of this dimension, and whenever he was in this dimension, he was just singing constantly. And so I sang Happy Together by the Turtles, because I find that if you just do that if you kind of do it like you're hypnotized, it's just a bit of a creepy song. And so I obviously kept that in my mind, because about 5 years later, I was running the summit for the Red Moon role-playing guys, and I just had a cultist start singing that at one of them. And because it works perfectly well in Cult as well, it's just something very creepy. Now, in terms of whether there's content that that, let's say I've been writing for Chronicles of Darkness that I realized, oh no, this is a better fit. There are definitely occasions where that does happen, because at a broad level, and it's not so easily defined now, because V5 is much closer to Requiem arguably than it was to V20 in tone. That's my opinion, and I see no issue with that because I love Requiem. It's street level horror, if you like. But before then, again, being very broad here, different people run in different ways. Vampire was quite existential. It was all about great big powerful creatures above you waiting to destroy you, whether it was the prince, whether it was your antediluvian, whether it was whoever. Whereas Requiem was more about the people beneath you and around you, swallowing you up or making you lose your identity, making you lose control because you lost your grip on them. And with things like touchstones and like, as I say, V5 has very much moved over to that Requiem tone. Now, that means, because I've written for Vampire the Requiem on a few books, sometimes you'll be writing something for Vampire the Requiem about some monster of legend, and you'll think, actually, the majority of Requiem games are not played like this. They're not played where you are, to use a really dire example, where you're not digging through an inverted pyramid underneath Mexico City to find the, I don't know, some tome of Sargon or something.
Right.
That would be a Sargon fragment. But actually, this monster and this location, so on, is far more Masquerade, which is arguably, or at least was more arguably, comic. And I don't mean comic in a comedic way. I mean in a sort of presentation way. It had more high drama, high action, and it makes it sound like I'm dismissing Masquerade. I'm not, because I think Masquerade is a great deal of fun.
Absolutely.
And likewise, V5, I think, has a bit of both of those things, and it seems to do it very well. From a lot of people who are playing it now, they seem to report that they love V5, so that's excellent. We got over those bumps in the road that took us to where we are now. But yeah, sometimes you'll be writing for one game and it can be transported to the other. Some games, however, especially if you're looking at World Darkness, Chronicles of Darkness, distinctions are very distinct right from the off. Vampire and Vampire both have the Ventru, both have the Gangrel, both have the Nosferatu. The Invictus is very Camarilla-like. The Carthians are very Anarch-like. The Loncaer Sanctum is kind of Sabbat-like. So there's some similarities there, but Wealth the Forsaken, second edition, is very distinct from Wealth the Apocalypse. Changeling the Lost is very distinct from Changeling the Dreaming. So if you're writing Wealth the Forsaken and you come up with something that you realize could be Fomori for Wealth the Apocalypse, I would wonder where your head was at when you were writing it in the first place. But sometimes you get it. I developed the Contagion Chronicle for Chronicles of Darkness, and I saw writers writing about Gaia, and I think someone wrote something about Krynos form in Wealth of Forsaken, because even though Forsaken is a very different game, werewolves still have different forms. They can still transform, and it's your Garou shape in Werewolf the Forsaken, but you are the Garou in Werewolf the Apocalypse. So I can absolutely see why a writer would get their wires crossed, because I've done it. So yeah, a long answer to a short question, but yes, it's certainly difficult at times, and certainly excellent at times to work on multiple games, because sometimes you will just come up with an idea and you think, I'll keep that in my pocket, and when I do start working on Mage the Ascension again, I can put that Nefandi concept in there instead.
Fantastic. And you mentioned a lot of my favorite aspects of all of those games in that answer too, so Nefandi, Fomori. So you mentioned earlier that you're getting back into producing the Gentleman Gamer videos, and we did have a question come in on Twitter previously to this interview that I wanted to touch on. How much of those videos are scripted and how much of them are improvised? I know you have said you do them all in a single take, which is also very impressive.
Yeah, single take without blinking. That's the thing I will have now. I'll put that on my tombstone, I think. Here lies Matthew Dawkins, single take without blinking. I don't script any of them. I don't script videos. I have occasionally had a short list of bullet points, but that's usually only if I'm doing a review of a book. Because if I'm doing a review, I will want to know the order of the chapters. But the thing is, if I've not reviewed a role-playing game for quite a long time, but what I would do, I would read the RPG, I would play it, and, well, I would run it and hopefully play it as well. and it led to my reviews being very in-depth and quite lengthy. But for me to remember the order that I needed to hit certain beats, I would just have the chapter list in front of me. Otherwise, it would just be everything from memory. And that's because, despite the fact I can generally remember elements of books and things about clans and tribes, I'm not as good at remembering words. I'm no, maybe I'm not really practiced at it, but in terms of memorizing a script, that feels a little too much like work. And when I record these videos, I want these to be spontaneous because I find spontaneity, stream of consciousness, people talking about things they love in an enthusiastic way, I find that interesting myself. So I've never aimed for these videos to be amazingly high production values or any production values for that matter. I've just always wanted to just be an enthusiastic fan sat in a chair talking about the games I like. So if that sometimes leads to me talking for 20 minutes about the Naga Raja, but I might only be able to make 9 minutes about the True Bruja because I'm not as interested in them, as an example.
Fantastic. And I will say, though, that with disregard to production value, they are excellent videos. And if anyone hasn't seen them, I will put a link to Matthew Dawkins' YouTube channel in the chat in a moment.
One thing I'll say, in case anyone watching these saw the World of Darkness 5th edition, or V5, I should say, vampire videos that I did last year. So again, I got asked at that point, do you script these? And no, I didn't. But it was very easy because I've been writing this material, so I just knew it.
Right.
Because I wasn't writing the words that I was speaking, but I was writing V5 at just about a month before the videos were recorded. I was asked whether I had a green screen for those, and no, I went out to a cemetery and filmed those. I was in front of a church dressed as a vampire, and because I was recording like 2 at a time, uploading them, and I saw someone on the first video, I think, say, you need to get a better background, that green screen is so obvious. And so by video 3 or 4, I was basically interacting with my scenery. I was fondling the door handle on the church just to show, look, I am actually here. I went out of my way to film in a bloody graveyard. And people were saying, could you turn the crows sound effects down? Because there was all this in the background. No, I couldn't, because they were there watching me record. It was, it was fun. And I'll probably do more Gentleman's Guide to Vampires at some point.
Fantastic.
But yeah, right now it's I've got my mind on Scion.
Great. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to that. Being personally less familiar with Scion than other work that you've done. And spoilers, this is a green screen behind me. Another question, and then I really want to dive into your work on World of Darkness and Vampire the Masquerade. But on your website, you mention you're also a video game designer and a voice actor, and you mentioned an as yet unannounced Paradox interactive game you are contributing to. Are there any hints or news on that project you could share?
Is there anything I can say on that? I don't think it's saying too much to say. Well, I got into writing content design for video games for Paradox via the guy who hired me to work on Kult, a guy by the name of Peter Nallo. Peter is works in content design as a team leader, basically, at Paradox Interactive, specifically in Paradox Arctic, which is up in Umeå, which is all the way up the top of Sweden. And so I had the pleasure of flying up to freezing cold Umeå. I say freezing cold, it's a fantastic town. It looks like the entire town was built by IKEA. It's very They've got under street heating. It's something I had never seen before, just to prevent there from ever being ice or snow.
Oh, wow.
For the cars. And there's occasionally these see-through panels in the road or the pavement, sidewalk, so that you can actually see these thermal tubes. It's like something out of the future, this Scandinavia. But anyway, so I went up there, did some content design, and what that basically entails is writing a lot of story, writing things like dialogue, scenarios, branching things, that kind of thing. But beyond that, I can't really tell you anything. I couldn't even tell you the status of the project at this point. The reason I mentioned someone like Petter is because if anyone really wants to fact check, they could ask him, did Matthew actually work with you? Yes. But I know the sad truth is, when it comes to video game development, especially with Paradox Interactive cancels 50% of all of its video games. And most studios are pretty similar to that, although Paradox are very tight with what they will actually release. And so I'm under no illusions that what I worked on may never see the light of day. And if that's the truth, I will be sad, because I spent a lot of time and energy, but that doesn't mean I wasn't paid for it, and that may sound mercenary, but I do this for a living.
Of course.
What I hope that it leads on to is maybe more video game work in the future. I don't know that I would ever do it permanently, full time, although it certainly probably pays better than working on tabletop RPGs. It's just quite an unreliable trade to work in as a contractor as well. So you're kind of doing it for a couple of months, and then the well is dry until you can find another company, and there's a lot of competition. So who knows? Hopefully one day you will see my name on a list of credits on a video game.
Fingers crossed. So that, as I said, jump into some World of Darkness and vampire conversation. An interesting thing on your resume, you have listed, or not on your resume, sorry, but there was a news release a while ago that you were hired as the senior community director for White Wolf.
Well, yes. So I kind of created this role for myself. I've got, in fact, Jason, Carl, and I literally came up with our own titles. So, all right. So the truth was, with this, last year when V5 was coming out, it wasn't even in retrospect, I was very much aware, a whole bunch of us were very much aware, that there was a lot of negative publicity that V5 was getting.
Of course.
And some of it was earned. A lot of it was earned. But in my experience, and I've worked in a lot of different fields pretty well, I've found that the best way to communicate with the audience, address problems, and get the audience focusing on what is good is you have to give them something good. You have to actually give them something to chew on. You drown out negativity with positivity. That doesn't mean you don't address the negative issues. You can, but you can't make them the headline for your own company again and again and again. Because what that results in is you just look like you're constantly out of control. You are always fighting fires. So I was working on V5 at the time, and Jason was sorting out all of his Geek and Sundry stuff. And I can't remember the exact circumstances behind it, but I know that I said, as well as doing the Gentleman Gamer thing, if you pay me this much per month, I will make videos for the Vampire Facebook page. We will make positive announcements, teasing content that will be in V5. We will engage the fans, because quite frankly, before that, there just wasn't any. And what we could have been doing all the way up until release was every single month we could have been saying, this is what the Bruja looked like, this is what the Nosferatu looked like, this is what the Malkavians. We could have been saying anything about metaplot. As long as we were doing something, people would have been hyped about it.
Absolutely.
And we were. And it wasn't my job to do that. It wasn't on me. I was just a contracted writer. But it got quite frustrating, honestly, for people, everyone in the team, honestly, that there wasn't that push to do it. And I don't think there's any one person that could be blamed for that. I think a part of the issue there is with White Wolf being a subsidiary, as it was then, of a very large battleship of a company that, and I think Paradox, in terms of video game companies, does maneuver a lot faster than some. It still maneuvers slowly. So they weren't going to suddenly create a role, or they weren't going to suddenly change direction without it having to go all the way up a chain and be signed off by this, that, and the other. That's my suspicion. But that said, it got to a point where the negativity was so overwhelming that I just threw my hat into the ring and said, I'll be the senior community director. I will essentially right the vessel, and I will do it for as long as I feel I need to get people talking about what's exciting again. So for about a month and a half, I just worked on constantly putting output out to talk about what was coming up in the game. And people watching this now, or listening to this later, or what have you, may agree, may disagree, that in the last month or so before the book was released, all of a sudden there was enthusiasm. All of a sudden people were talking about what this game might contain. Until then, no one had been doing that at all. And I think it probably sounds arrogant, but, fuck it, I did the work. A lot of that was down to my efforts. It was down to Jason Carl's efforts. Yep. And that's not taking anything away from the creative team, because I was on the creative team as well. It wasn't their job to do it. The problem was there wasn't anyone in the place to do it.
Right.
So we did that, and I got to the end of my contract. I was offered to make it permanent, essentially. And by that point, I had already started recruiting other community managers, and some of them are still working for Paradox today in that capacity. And I said no, I didn't want to, because my main interest is in creative. I'm not marketing. I've done marketing before, and it's something I'm good at, but not something I particularly want to devote all my time to. And so I turned that down and went back to writing games and developing games. It was just a minor break to focus on something else, really.
It was certainly needed as well. A little bit of background on myself. I've been playing vampires since 1999, and I actually didn't know E5 was coming out until much of that content that you just described started appearing. Even as a longtime fan of the game, it had definitely flown under the radar for quite some time. So I definitely personally appreciate all of the effort that you put into that. And I also used to work in marketing, so I can understand what that entails and how much effort, how much time is devoted to those things beyond what your true calling. So thank you.
No, that's quite all right. It was enjoyable to do at the time, which may sound odd, because one of the rules Jason and I had was we would reply to absolutely every person who messaged, and that's not always a good strategy, but we needed to make sure the fans felt like they were being heard. So sometimes people would be messaging us with perfectly legitimate criticism, Sometimes people would just be upset that they hadn't heard anything about Clan Ravnos yet. Sometimes people would be writing in with some nonsense about how I bet you're not going to show any Muslim vampires to be extremists. And I don't know what they expected us to do off the back of that, but we still responded to everything. Sometimes it was just to shut people down. In the latter case, for instance, say, no, probably not. Why would we? Bye. But we still did that. And so that took a lot of time and energy, but I think it was worth it in the end. I remember at Gen Con last year when V5 was released, they sold out within the first day of all the copies they took to Gen Con. And I was on the Onyx Path booth on the other side and just occasionally swapping over. And in the end, they had to get more copies from Modiphius to sell. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had any left. So, yeah, it was a very good release.
Fantastic. So, speaking of your contributions and working with the creative team, specifically for 5th edition, what are your favorite aspects about this new edition of Vampire the Masquerade? Either your own contributions or work that other people.
My favorite parts of V5, and a lot of people say this, and I think it's because it's genuinely very good, is the hunger system.
Yes.
Because I think it really gets back to what playing a vampire should be about. And it's, in a way, it's one of those things that you look at and you think, why was this never thought of before? I think it's that good. And whenever there's an idea that you think this should have always been there, I think that kind of thing is a mark of a system's excellence. Now, that's not to say hunger isn't. That it's perfect. I have seen some storytellers apply hunger rolls quite arbitrarily and quite frequently, like rouse checks constantly.
Yeah.
And you don't need to do that. That isn't the point of it. Right. It is to be used in times of stress when a vampire going off the boil would actually be interesting to the plot. And I think when used like that, it's a hell of a lot more dynamic than a blood pool system, as an example. I am a big fan of the empowerment of the Anarch movement from a setting perspective, because going all the way back to original Vampire and the early days of 2nd edition, the Anarchs were an actual movement. And it was only in revised edition or 3rd edition that the Anarchs were more of a joke, that were just constantly squabbling with each other. And then I say that there's perfectly good writing in things like the Anarch's Handbook that implies that they're not, that they are a serious sect to be dealt with. But every other book with Anarchs in never portrayed them as being terribly effective. I think V20's Anarchs Unbound did a huge job, and it's probably a book that hasn't been read widely enough. Anarchs Unbound is fantastic. It really portrays Anarchs how they should be in the modern era. And then, of course, you got the V5, where Anarchs are the second pillar sect, really, next to the Camarilla. And I really like that, because both are eminently playable. Both have the morality system, which is at the core of Vampire. So you don't need to worry about passive enlightenment, things like that, and playing alien monsters. But they have quite opposed views, and now the Camarilla is directly persecuting the Anarchs. I think that makes for a more interesting story.
I agree. And for me, the hunger system was one of the most important improvements made with 5th edition. As someone had just said in chat, and I've heard people in my own group say, it turns the game into a risk management system as opposed to a resource management system. You actually feel the effects of the beast in your gameplay with the hunger system, as opposed to, well, do I have a big enough blood pool to use this ability now, or do I need to feed and then come back? And much more story driven instead of having to stop and think about mechanically form actions.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned with the Anarchs, and Anarchs, I agree, Anarchs Unbound is a fantastic book that needs to be widely absorbed for playing V20, which I highly support. For me, I view V20 and V5 as different games. They both have their place on the bookshelf. What elements from V20 did you hope to incorporate into V5 and make more prominent, much like making the Anarchs a more serious act?
Most of them were things that I added to Beckett's Jihad Diary. And thankfully, because I have rather cunningly sort of weaseled my way into every single product, not every for V5, I've pretty much been able to carry over everything that I've wanted to from V20. And that includes things like the Clan of Death's changes, here's one that I didn't get to move over. So, no, actually, before we get onto that, so the Drowned Legacies, they are the predators, for want of a better word, of South America. So I introduced them in Beckett's Jihad Diary. So that was right at the tail end of V20. Yes. And I did them with the support consultation of two individuals from South America, one individual from Central America, very well versed in their region's mythology. I certainly didn't want to just make up monsters and say, here, these monsters have been here all along. What's more, I thought if we do the age-old story of this monster was powerful until colonialism, empire, and subjugation, and then they went downhill with the rest of the indigenous people, that would be quite dull, and it would also be disrespectful. So what I instead did was essentially portray all of the Drowned Legacies as almost chameleon-esque, that they, being consummate predators, absolutely identified the way the wind was blowing. So when Pizarro and Cortez and all the rest started turning up and laying waste to civilization as they knew it, they folded themselves into the colonist side. There would have been some, no doubt, that were attached to the people that they had been around for hundreds of years, but there were others, probably more, that were attracted to the blood and expansionist aims of these people that were invading. So the fact that they then just sort of fold into the background and disappear for around 500 years is a matter of survival. They knew that if they were going around practicing the cultural maxims of people long dead, they would be hunted down too. So they had to adapt to survive. They did it very well. And now, with the Gehenna Crusade and their beckoning and all that, now they're coming back and they're saying, well, we've actually been here all along. We're not coming back from anywhere. We're just taking what was ours 500 years ago, you Spanish and Portuguese bastards. Now, I would really love for the Drowned Legacies to appear again in V5. In fact, a couple of them have already, not just in Chicago by Night, in, I think, V5 Camarilla, and they may even appear in the V5 Core. I'm not sure. You can see a couple of references to them, so they are there. But I don't know if we will ever get to do a book on them. At least not in the immediate future. That's ultimately going to be down to Paradox and Modiphius. So in terms of things that I didn't get to carry over, but I would really love to. That I would have really loved to, because things have changed now. This isn't going to change back. Beckett's Jihad Diary had it set up that the followers of Set were very close to joining the Camera.
Yes.
And here's an insight into the V5 design process. 3 Gen Cons ago, when I had first started working on V5, really, I had pitched that the followers of Set should be a new clan in the Camarilla, especially as we were moving the Bruja over to the Anarchs. And so I had to come up with a pitch document, an essay. I had to do a presentation to the White Wolf team at Gen Con, and that was all very convincing. People really loved it. Got back to the UK. We had a meeting about it. And one of the other authors said, well, I honestly think the Assamites should be in the Camarilla because that's the way the lore has been going. And there's no way the Assamites and the Setites would join at the same time. And I said, my argument was, the Assamites are the obvious choice. And the Setites, while not obvious, are not flagrantly ridiculous, like if we had, let's say, the Zimitzi join the Camarilla. So let's throw a curveball. Let's have the Assamites, something happen to them, like they end up having to join the Anarchs for the Sanctuary, and the Setites capitalize on it, just to really mix things up. And because the Setites play so well with social dynamics, because they have the religious aspect as well, it could fill a new niche within the Camarilla that no clan really did. They're both pushers and religious. Now, another author on the book said, well, I think what would be fantastic is if the La Sombra join the Camarilla, because they also have the religious aspect. Why don't they bring that religious aspect over from the Fallen Sabbat and bring it over to the Camarilla? So now there were 3 authors with 3 competing pitches. We all had to go away and write our pitches, which pissed me off, honestly, because I'd already written a pretty good one. And make them again. And this was actually what a lot of the V5 development time was spent on. There was a lot of throwing ideas at the wall, which I think was worthwhile in some cases. In other cases, it was far too much time when we could have just set on a direction. And we submitted these pitches. Nothing happened for about 2 months. We were chasing them occasionally, because we needed to know, what are we writing? Which disciplines are we writing? Right. Which clans are we writing? Which clans are we saying are in the Camarilla? Which clans are we saying are in the Anarchs? Is a very important part of Vampire the Masquerade.
Absolutely.
And in the end, I think Martin decided we're going to go for the Assamites, or the Banu Hakim, as they ended up joining the Camarilla. The La Sombra would join the Camarilla at some point in the future, which was Chicago by Night, as we found out, because I pushed for that in the end. And the Setites, he never really liked them in the first place. And that was a bit irritating because my pitch had been accepted, and then because obviously other authors had given conflicting pitches, my idea kind of got pushed aside. These things happen occasionally in game design, in any kind of creative design. These things happen, and so I lived with it. But I then made the counter pitch. Well, in that case, I think the Setites should undergo, because everything in the lore in Beckett's Jihad Diary is leading up to them being accepted in the Camarilla. So something has to go wrong.
Yes.
Something completely sabotages their attempt. And almost as a big fuck you to the Camarilla, they join the Anarchs, because the Anarchs are now a sect to be feared, or they soon will be.
Right.
And so that's how we ended up with the Setites and the Anarchs instead. And they rebranded as the Ministry.
Yes.
So yeah, that's that story. That's the first time I've spoken about that, I think.
Interesting. I could definitely have seen the Setites moving into the Camarilla. I followed that through the Jihad Diary. Very interesting why it didn't happen. Speaking of the Jihad Diary, I love the work you did on that. We actually streamed a reading of portions of it a few weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
One of my other co-hosts, Marchosius, sat and read from it. Can we expect to see more work like that in V5? Are you interested in doing more of that, like prose fiction style work as a source book, or even can we expect to see more clan style novels or clan novel style work?
So I believe the fiction line is now with another company. Is with a specific company to write. Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you who, and I don't know if it's public knowledge anyway.
Interesting.
The idea of doing another role-playing game source book like Beckett's Jihad Diary, I can't really express how much effort that took, but I would love to see another book like that. The one thing that Beckett's Jihad Diary, I guess, isn't necessarily clear to everyone that reads it, is the production values on Beckett's Jihad Diary are actually pretty huge, and it's not in the sense that it's all that you've got embossed paper and you've got little raised bits for paper clips and things like that. That isn't the case. It's the fact that not only did the book have to be written like that, which isn't an easy feat, it also had to be laid out like that,
Right.
which meant a lot of art and a lot of layout and a lot of time. And that's the big thing with a book that's not laid out in the traditional writing art writing fashion. It makes for a very hard job for the layout artist. That's not to say we can't do it, but we have to find absolutely the right project to do it. I wouldn't be opposed to having a V5 version of the Book of Nod, an expanded Book of Nod, for instance. Or completely different holy text or unholy text, which could be written in a similar way. But yeah, it would have to be the right project. It would have to be approved by Modifius as well. And right now, I don't think anything like that's on the immediate horizon. Beckett's Jihad Diary is still pretty new, all told. So, and the V5, well, the Anarch book, in fact, is very much like it as well. So I don't think we'll see anything like that just yet, but never say never.
Fantastic. Well, I will have my fingers crossed for a V5 Book of Nod personally. That would be great.
Yeah, and hopefully mean very little writing if we can just copy it. But I think some fans will be a bit upset by that.
Maybe. So a question came in while you were speaking, particularly about V5, and obviously you had a direction you wanted to see the Settites go in, and that it worked out in the end. I would say that's certainly interesting. Yeah. Is there anything about V5 that you just straight up would have done differently that you just aren't a big fan of? Without throwing any other designers under the bus.
No, and it's like a designer's code. I guess it's the same as any profession. You don't generally go on an interview and say this person's a real dickhead. But no, is there anything I absolutely would not have done? I probably wouldn't have taken the Sabbat in the direction that they've gone. Because I know how much people love the Sabbat, and I know White Wolf and Paradox know that too. The thing is, what I don't have in this case is full view of their plan for the Sabbat. So if Paradox have got some fantastic idea in mind, or lots of ideas that are permeating all of our other books about what the Sabbat are up to and how they're going to come back as a deadly force, and I've certainly seeded things into things like the La Sombra write-up in Chicago by Night to imply that if any Sabbat are left, just think of how many people they would have diablerized to survive the kind of horrible blood gods that they will be when they return. So there's certainly potential there, but that's certainly not how I saw the Sabbat going. It's difficult because I can absolutely understand why making the Sabbat into psychotic, blood-fueled monsters, again, is a good way of making them mysterious, scary, kindred bogeymen. I think that's a good thing to do. But I don't know that I would have moved them all to a roughly similar geographical location and had their activities covered by mortal war zones. And part of my hesitation there is because I've never been a massive proponent of using real world politics, at least not present day real world politics, to sort of embed vampire lore. And there's a lot of good reasons for that, from decency all the way through to pragmatism. And my pragmatic view is, if I were to, and I don't think we have done this, but as an example, if I were to in the V5 core book say something like, there's a legion of La Sombra and Zumitzi in Baghdad right now, and they are tearing the city apart, and luckily that's been masqueraded by bombing. Well, by the time people read that 2 years later, Baghdad isn't being bombed.
Right.
So you are dating your work. You're making it less relatable. And here's the ultra pragmatist view of using real world geopolitical events, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. And as I say, this is ultra pragmatic. The vast majority of our audience do not live in North Africa or the Middle East. That's not to say you can't write about it, but if you are focusing an entire event, metaplot event, realm-shattering event, if you want to get a bit D&D, in that region, and at some point you're going to make it playable, you're expecting people to uproot their chronicles from the safe little burgs they know and love, like Chicago and London and Paris and wherever else they're from, and put them in Tripoli and Baghdad and Cairo and wherever. And a lot of people can't wrap their heads around the idea of playing in a geographical location where they don't know the culture intimately. Right. And that's not a bad thing for a storyteller or players to admit. It's far better to say, I don't have the time to do the research. Right. Therefore, I'm not going to stereotype. I would rather play in locations I know, North America and Western Europe. Some people might, however, say that's dull. I'm up for an adventure. They'll do the research. They'll look at more than a Wikipedia article, and they will set a really fantastic chronicle in Jerusalem right now. But not everyone can. So I think there's a risk there to putting the Gehenna Crusade there. I know why it's there. I know that that's where the vast majority of Methuselahs and Antediluvians are likely to be in the vampire metaplot, but I don't know I would have done it in the exact same way.
I agree, and I think that that there's been a criticism against White Wolf historically for setting events in cities and then the writers not being familiar with them. The original Chicago by Night, DC, and they've certainly made strides to bring in writers who are from the area are writing, which simply speaks to the strength of what you were saying. There's something to be said about familiarity with subject matter before you fictionalize, and then obviously keeping it in a timely manner. We have community members, one of them's in chat right now, who live in South America, and the Sabbat's presence in South America historically has been a little troublesome because of cultural differences.
I mean, you could say the same with Mexico City and Montreal. That South America is particularly big issue, I would say, saying the Sabbat was somehow wildly successful in South America. South America, and I've never been to South America. I put my hand up. It's a place I've researched fairly extensively. I know that much like North America, you sometimes get cities with great swathes of nothing between them. And that feels more like a Camarilla thing, Dark Ages domain, than it does Sabbat all closed in and, rampaging war parties going from city to city. You can't really rampage across Brazil, because Brazil is epic in size and scope, and an awful lot of it is not easily traversable. So I think the reason, and I'm purely guessing here because I've not spoken to them about it, I'm guessing the original designers, probably of World of Darkness 2nd edition, I think it would have been, the Black Book, put the Sabbats in South America, is probably the Catholicism.
Yeah.
That's about the only reason I can think that's a good reason. Anything else, it would be either they're putting them there because they don't know what else to put there, they're putting them there because it's a culture they don't necessarily understand. I doubt it was either of those things. I hope it wasn't either of those things. I suspect it was because the Sabbat has got the inversion of Catholic faith, and because in most parts of South America there's such a predominance of Catholic faith, they thought they could layer the two on top, and I'm not sure how well it works, really.
Absolutely. Changing direction a little bit, and jumping back over to 5, I want to pick your brain a little bit about Chicago by Night, and particularly the supplements that we. So, as a backer of Chicago by Night, I have had a chance to read the book. But there's obviously Let the Streets Run Red and the Chicago folios that we haven't seen yet and are very excited for. Can you kind of maybe just give us a little bit of an overview of what we can expect in them? I know I've seen some hints of some new rituals.
Yeah.
So what do we have to look forward to?
So I'm looking forward to both of these books a great deal for different reasons. Chicago Folios is going to give every single storyteller more story ideas than they can ever possibly use. I'm a big proponent in all of the books I develop, putting lots and lots of story hooks in every single paragraph, and Chicago Folios is exactly that. It's a mixture of in-character artifacts and, like Becca's Jihad Diary, in fact, and story hooks that are divided between the Camarilla, the Anarchs, Second Inquisition, independent clans, and various heretical cults. You've got a whole bunch of new characters in there as well. You've got a whole bunch of, I think, you've got a few new blood sorcery rituals in there too. And it's a book that has just got so many ideas thrown into it that I think, much like Becca's Jihad Diary, you could keep reading through it over and over again, just keep finding new stories. And the wonderful thing is some of them connect up to each other as well, and I'm a big fan of connectivity in my work. I enjoy readers being able to read something on one page and then 3 days later they read something on another page and there's something in their brain that makes them go, oh yeah, okay, I get it. I think it's something that's not tapped into enough, the idea of making your readers feel smart. Because when people, much like when they're reading a murder mystery and they solve the murder before the detective does, some people hate that, some people love it, but if when the detective is explaining what's going on, or they saw it beforehand, and that light bulb flicks on, there's a small sense of euphoria, as accomplishment. The reader feels like they've done it, they worked it out.
Absolutely.
And Chicago Folios is full of those little things. So yeah, I like that a lot, and it reintroduces some old favorites as well. We find out what happened to Capone, Al Capone. He appears in Chicago Folios. And in fact, you know what? Let's make this the official announcement that as of V5, Alphonse Gabriel Capone is still very much upright. He is not Ash. But due to increased Second Inquisition scrutiny, he is certainly not parading around in the street looking. Well, he's certainly not parading around in the street, quite frankly. He is, as a Capone character should be, very much in the background controlling minions.
Excellent.
And yeah, you'll find out more about him when the book comes out. And in fact, I think we may even include him on one of the extracts on the next Chicago by Night backer update. I think you will be given exclusive access to some
Awesome.
of the Chicago Folios extracts, and Capone may be in there. Let the Streets Run Red, which is another book I'm really looking forward to, and Kareem Amar of the creative team at Paradox loves this book. It contains 4 complete stories, as in playable chronicles, short form, I guess. Same length as The Sacrifice in Chicago by Night. Some are a little bit shorter, most are longer. The first is set in Chicago, using a couple of characters from Chicago by Night, but mostly new characters who've got a strong mortal focus, a very paramilitary Second Inquisition story, where amateur hunters don't get in above their depth, but certainly have some of the wrong ideas about vampires and really make lives hell for your protagonists. Excellent. The second chronicle is set in Millington, Illinois, which is going to be a town no one has ever heard of because it's a rural chronicle. It's folk horror, as we were speaking about earlier.
Awesome.
And Illinois is basically cornfields, lots and lots and lots of cornfields, and a small town where the trick is basically the vast majority of people living in that town are a willing herd to a bunch of vampires. They perform sacrifices to the harvest god. It's all very fun. The third one is split between the domains of Milwaukee and Indianapolis, and is a traveling story. But we provide a lot of coverage of what both of those domains look like in V5, to the point that you probably don't need a separate city sourcebook for either. And one of those things I was talking to you about before we started streaming is what Milwaukee and Indianapolis will show is when I'm developing these books, no domain will look identical in hierarchy. It's an absolute objective of mine that no one city will have the same Prince, Primogen, Sheriff, Harpies setup. So Milwaukee, as an example, which still has Mark Decker as Prince, a gangrel, is basically a militarized police state at this point, mostly because of lupines and anarchs and Mark Decker's paranoia. And he's still Prince. There's no Primogen. The council was disbanded because of the war footing. So they've essentially declared martial law. And the court in the city is more of a judicial court. There are 3 judges appointed, one of whom is the Prince. There is a court executioner. There is a gang of hounds who are the Anubai, who were in Milwaukee by Night all the way back when. And there's such strict rules as kindred cannot gather in groups larger than this because of Second Inquisition and lupines. Kindred are not allowed to ever mention in an affectionate or honorific way anyone who has been exiled or executed by the court. It's got a very Orwellian feel to it, which is deliberate. It's still Camarilla, it's still very much Camarilla because they're very much about the Masquerade, and the rest of the traditions, but they have their own traditions on top.
Fantastic.
And the last one is set in good old Gary, Indiana, because chapter return to Gary. And I don't know when we'll return to Gary again, but this chronicle reintroduces us to such beloved characters as Modius and Juggler and Evelyn, Alicia, and some other old familiar faces and some new ones too. And this one is a bit of a mystery to solve. Who is pulling the strings in the background? It's not Al Capone. But yeah, it will be a character that you know from previous Chicago by Night source books.
Excellent. I know a lot of people are very excited for some of the Near Dark Studios crew in chat earlier. I know they're very excited for all of the Chicago from that area themselves.
Well, this is sorry,
No, no.
the thing that I really want people to understand about Chicago. And its surrounding environs of Milwaukee, Indianapolis, Gary. Obviously, they're all cities in their own right, and in some cases, they're huge. But Chicago is very much at the center of that hub. Chicago is like a campaign setting for D&D. And some people look at city source books and they say, well, I'm not from that city, so I'm not interested. I think that they may be looking at them from the wrong perspective. And that's a big judgment on my part. But I think that every single city source book should be seen as a campaign setting like the Forgotten Realms or Birthright or Planescape or Karatur or whatever. The fact is that you can pull so much from these campaign settings and put them in your own chronicles, or you can put characters in there and you can play with so many of the tools arrayed around that you will learn about the city and you will make it your own. It doesn't matter if Chicago isn't authentic, because if your players are never going to go to Chicago, then you're just building the city from scratch. But to the people who do want authenticity, everything in the book is written in part by Chicagoans, and for the rest of us, people who have researched Chicago. So, yeah, I think treat it as a campaign setting. This is your Dale lands if you want to get a micro level, but if a major one, the entire Forgotten Realms is based in Chicago and its surrounding cities.
I think that is a really good way of looking at it. Having flipped through it, I know that there's also some new mechanical information that people can utilize in other games, which, in the same vein, a world setting for Dungeons and Dragons classes and that.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting perspective on it, because I know a lot. I have done the same myself. It's like I have no interest in running Montreal by Night. I'm not going to pick up that book, and then I think about it again later, and I'm like, but there's interesting things in that book that I want to read.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. So Chicago by Night, the Kickstarter has ended. People can still pre-order it, I believe, on BackerKit.
No,
Oh, did
we
that
have
one end?
we have shut the backer kit down because we are shipping books out very soon.
Exciting.
So yeah, now you will have to pre-order it through your local gaming store, which you can do.
Excellent.
It will be available in your friendly local gaming store. It will be available in bookstores. It will be available on Amazon, and that will be where you get your traditionally printed version. If you are happy to have print on demand, you can also order it from DriveThruRPG,
Of course.
where we of course put all of our books.
Excellent. That leads me to the next V5 supplement, Cults of the Blood Gods. And we've talked about it a little bit with some of the items in the Chicago folios, but can you tell us about kind of the development of Cults of the Blood Gods? Where did that start out of some of the ideas that were being Chicago, or was that kind of already on the table at the same time?
So I'll go back to the Forgotten Realms actually, because one of my favorite campaign setting for D&D is Planescape, as any intelligent person would tell you.
It is a good one.
But my favorite source book for Dungeons and Dragons is a second edition AD&D book called Faiths and Avatars for Forgotten Realms. And it basically profiles all of the major, intermediate, and lesser human deities. It gives you a little bit of the deity's history. It gives you a bit about their church, their congregation. It gives you some unique powers for the faithful, and sometimes a specific class for that church. It also tells you about that church's relationship with other churches. and I am a big fan of Faiths and Avatars. The print is so small, but it packs so much information into a really brilliant book. I love it. I can read it and read it and read it. Now, when I was, ever since I started developing Vampire, to be honest, but mostly when it came to V5, I proposed with V5 the idea of Methuselah worship, Methuselah veneration. And while none of my material, I didn't write any of this material for the V5 Camarilla book, but it was my proposal that it got added. And I still thought, well, I want an entire book dedicated to religion, to vampire religion, because we've never had one. We've had State of Grace, which is kind of that way. It's mostly Golconda focused.
Yeah.
Cainite Heresy, which is based around a very specific group of kindred worship. But you don't really have a book which is a big combination of religions, faiths, beliefs, and powers associated with. And that's what I wanted Cults of the Blood Gods to be. So I pitched it, it got approved, started working on it. Simple as that. The other part of it was one of the biggest cults in Vampire, whether people like to think of it as one or not, is the Giovanni, or the Clan of Death, the Cappadocians, the Hecata, as they are in V5. They are family worshippers. They worship structure, the structure of family. They worship death as a concept that they can actually manipulate. Some of them worship the idea of the end of the world. They are a doomsday cult. They are trying to further the end of the world with the endless night.
Absolutely.
Not all of them are, mind you, but likewise, not all members at the upper end of a cult are telling the people down the bottom what their actual objective is until it's time to drink the Kool-Aid.
Yep.
So Cult of the Blood Gods contains the Hecata in full, probably, and this is the most bizarre thing, they are going to be the clan with the largest write-up so far in V5, including powers. So they've got their clan splat, much like the La Sombra do in Chicago by Night, but they have an entire chapter dedicated to the cult of death and undeath, and that's them. That's all about their history, their plans, their structure, and you don't have that in any other book yet.
Awesome.
But you've also got the Church of Set, you've got the Cult of Mithras, you've got the Bahari, you've got the Church of Cain, you've got the Ash Finders, they're a new one. You have... gosh, a lot. There are quite a few religions in here, but it's not just one big book of religions. It also has mechanics for constructing your own cult in game, of course, not out of character. It has a bunch of mortal cults in there as well, so mortal religions that sometimes gravitate around vampires. It's got an entire chronicle you can play set in the city of Munich.
Excellent.
So we've got a Munich campaign setting as well now. We have, what else do we have in there? Lots of lore sheets, lots of powers. And yeah, I'm sure there is more in there that I am forgetting about. Oh, and lots of in-character stuff about the rise of the Methuselah cult, where this burgeoning of religion has come from in the last edition. And has it always been there, or is it new?
Absolutely.
And we've got lots of minor religions as well, so that they don't get the full treatment, like the Servitors of Irad, the Gorgo's Nest, I think. We've got the Eyes of Malachi, and yeah, lots and lots and lots of things in there. I think I'm, as a games developer, as a writer, and as a fan, I want every single book I pick up to have tools for players and storytellers, because I don't know what I'm going to be when I'm buying a book off a shelf.
Absolutely.
I want there needs to be something in there for me as a player and something for me as a storyteller. As a games designer, I need that to be in there, because there is no point to making a book that is exclusively for storytellers, because you have automatically cut your audience by into a sixth potentially, or a quarter of your potential audience. So there needs to be something for everyone in every single book, and I'm very confident that Cults of the Blood Gods has that.
Amazing. I am incredibly excited for that one. I'm going to ask 2 questions from chat here, and then I'm going to ask you kind of a final wrap-up question on the World of Darkness as a whole, and then kind of change direction and talk about another favorite game of mine, Kult.
Okay.
So Lily, who's a member of our community and one of our Discord mods, is asking if you can tease if there's any more sorcery or rituals coming for Setites or the ministry.
Yeah, the Cults of the Blood Gods does have some Church of Set specific powers. Now, I say the Church of Set specific. In theory, any member of the ministry could learn them. There's some of them I think are straight power, some of them are amalgams. Some you might recognize from previous editions. I think we've got True Love's Face back in there. We've got Mental Maze in there, and also Heart of Darkness. May have been renamed because the power's been changed slightly. Okay. But everyone always loved the idea of being able to extract your heart and put it in a canopic jar. So yeah, that's back in. It's a very powerful discipline. Excellent. Of course, you have to. It's something like a 4 and 3 amalgam, so you're going to be spending a lot of experience to buy it, but you should, because if you're basically rendering yourself immune to staking forever by burying your heart in a desert somewhere, yeah, you should be paying quite a lot to do that.
Absolutely. The next question is actually from me, regarding building your own cult and kind of just different new religious factions that you're introducing. Do we have any that are more focused on pagan religion, or kind of more of that like nature and spiritual side of?
Yeah, in many ways, the Bahari are. Although we have Lilith, of course, as this totemic head, most, I would argue, most Bahari probably don't actually cleave to the idea of Lilith so much as being a central part of nature. Cult of Isis are in there as well, and they are kind of the other side of that coin.
Excellent.
Well, similar ideas, but they don't necessarily see eye to eye. But no, it's a good question, because we've got so many religions in there, I can't actually remember all of them off the top of my head. But yes, I think there's definitely going to be something for everyone in there, including the more pagan side of things.
Excellent. So just a reminder to our friends in chat, you can drop questions in at any time. I am paying attention. I will drop them in when it's most appropriate. Jumping back over to World of Darkness. So we did hear the announcement for Werewolf 5th edition with an as yet unannounced partner from Paradox. What system, what splat really, Mage, Wraith, etc. do you want to see updated for 5th edition? Or
well,
would you
that's
like to work on?
Yeah, in terms of the one I'd like to work on, probably Wraith. Wraith is my World of Darkness game. I know everyone thinks it's Vampire because I've done so much with it. But no, Wraith is my favorite World of Darkness game, so I would love to deliver that into a 5th edition.
Awesome.
But we'll have to see. It's never been the most popular of World of Darkness games, unfairly so, but I can absolutely understand why. And it's not because of the subject matter. It's not really even because of the shadow mechanic. It's because the game is predominantly set not in the World of Darkness.
Right.
And so that removes you from the locations that you know so well and interacting with mortals. And yeah, I think that really confuses some people in the same way Planescape does, because everything's so alien in that D&D setting.
Absolutely.
It's just not something everyone can just get. So yeah, I'd make some changes, but I would love to do Wraith. Wraith was my first core book that I ever wrote on, actually, Wraith 20.
Really?
Come to think of it. Strange to realize. Yeah.
Fantastic. No, I've never gotten the chance to play or run a Wraith game, but it is the one that interests me the most of all of the extended line of World of Darkness.
Yeah.
Um, Speaking of darker games, um, Cult. Cult has kind of had a bit of a resurgence lately. It's got a boost in popularity, probably in no small part to Red Moon Role Playing, who are a fantastic group. But you've also been working on Cult, I believe specifically writing scenarios for some of the supplements.
Yeah.
How did you get involved with working on Cult with Helmgast?
So I mentioned Petter, really giving him a lot of shout outs. He approached me to work on cults because he found my YouTube channel. And so this was after I after I was writing RPGs, although I was still only doing it part time at the time. He found a video of mine where I think I talk about establishing setting, how to evoke mood and tone. And apparently, I do a video where I describe something like an abattoir with horrible smells and people hanging off hooks and things like that. And I can't remember. I've done a lot of videos, and as I say, most of them are improvised, or all of them are improvised. So sometimes it's what the ideas come out, and then I forget. I certainly don't watch them again.
You've certainly used that idea recently.
Yes, I went back to it. I know. But Petter saw this and thought, wow, this person really gets cult. And so he approached me, I think, through the YouTube channel's messenger first. And then I managed to reach him outside of it to say, would you like to write something for Cult? And I said, yeah, sure. And that's when he found out that I was also writing other RPGs. It was just a happy coincidence. I think he just wanted me to write a short scenario at the time, but then he realized he had a lot more trouble on his hands than he anticipated. And it was only through that, working with him on Cult, really, that he ended up hiring me to work for Paradox on the video game side of things. I don't even think he knew at the time that I was working on V5 when that happened. So yeah, it was just it's a big company.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But yeah, that's how I ended up working for Helmgast on Cult, and they are a fantastic crew. It's a wonderfully creative, terrifying game.
Oh yes.
Very different to World of Darkness, incredibly so. But I say that there's certainly going to be aspects. If you like Cult, you will recognize parts of it in the Church of Cain in Cults of the Blood Gods. That's one of those things where, going back to our earlier conversation about writing ideas for one game and realizing you can put them in another.
Yes.
The Church of Cain benefits from that Gnostic idea of Earth as a version of hell, or just a layer of hell.
Excellent. Oh, that makes me more excited somehow for Cults of the Blood Gods. So as we mentioned, the abattoir with meat hanging off of hooks, et cetera, which I apologize, maybe a bit of a spoiler. You wrote the summit for Taraticum. And
Yes.
most recently, you have been running it for the gentleman over at Red Moon Role Playing. And I believe the first 2 episodes are out of that so far.
Yeah, I don't think has episode 3 come out yet. Either way, yeah, the first 2 or 3 are out definitely.
I'm actually looking on my phone right now to see if it's downloaded because I have it set to automatically download. No, it looks like only the first 2 have come out, and then of course they had their Mummy game.
Yes, of course. I'm running that as well.
Absolutely. So I'm looking forward to episode 3 of the summit. I won't lie. What kind of influenced that game? It's a very dark game for those of you who haven't heard or read it. Even darker, I think, than a lot of the stories told in Cult in the pre-written. scenarios. As one of my co-hosts put it, it's kind of Cult set to hard mode.
Yeah, I think the summit is horrifying because at least part of it is relatable. It's horrifying in the same way, although certainly not the same genre, as Changing the Lost is horrifying, because people, any one of us, can relate to being in a strange place surrounded by strange people who don't necessarily like you or know you, and feeling isolated, or you can't speak the language, you lost your friend and you're in a foreign country. Now what are you going to do? Or to take it back to childhood, you were told to stand by the milk and your mum went off to pick up some vegetables, and then for whatever reason you wandered off and now you can't find your mum anymore. So the idea of being isolated, stranded, and surrounded by hostile people is certainly something that is relatable. And that's where the summit really starts off. It certainly did for this group. The actual scenario doesn't... So, spoilers, but in Red Moon Role Playing's actual play, they decided that they would all be playing parents, and the thing that they would lose at the beginning would be their children, or that they would be at risk of losing was their children. Now, in the scenario as written, it doesn't have to be that. You can be a bunch of criminals who lose the stash. The suitcase for Marcellus Wallace gets stolen, and so you've got to go after the people that stole it from you or whatever. They went for the, I guess you could argue, most miserable version. But I think that plays well to Cult's themes. It's fun in a game like Cult sometimes to take the hardened criminal down a peg or two and show him that everything he thought was harsh and nasty about the world is nothing compared to what Metropolis and Inferno can throw at you. But in this particular scenario that I'm running for Red Moon Role Playing, there's a lot more desperation to it, because in the end you could, if you were the criminals, you could turn around, leave, in theory, go to your boss and say, we lost your case of diamonds, boss. and the worst that could happen is you might die. In the scenario they're playing, if they turn around and leave, they're not going to die. They're just going to be forever knowing that they left their children in this horribly hostile place. In terms of what influenced the summit, it's without shadow of a doubt J.G. Ballard. J.G. Ballard, as I mentioned on a few podcasts, is probably my favorite author. I always sort of say the authors I take most inspiration from, bear in mind I don't really write fiction, not often anyway. I should probably try doing it more. The three J's: James Joyce, J.G. Ballard, and Jane Austen. And I didn't just pick them because they all begin with J. It's because they all have something to their writing style that really appeals to me. It means I can just keep reading through them easily. And in J.G. Ballard's case, quite contrary to someone like Jane Austen, his characters are usually almost faceless. The reader puts themselves in the character because the author tends to be telling you what's going on from their perspective. It isn't first person, but it's J.G. Ballard has kind of inserted himself cranked up to 11 into his novels. Now, in a book, but that said, his descriptions of places, his descriptions of injuries, of events are so well written, and in a way that no one else, I say no one else, one other author writes in a similar way, and that's Will Self. But they both Will Self and J.G. Ballard write in this way that's so evocative. And it's what I try and do with all of my locations in role-playing games. Whether I'm running a game or writing a game, I find that a location requires character. It's the difference between having a gunfight in a warehouse and having a gunfight in a warehouse where there's a gantry across the top with a loose panel in it, a conveyor belt with boxes moving on there as well. And, the more things you can add to it, is if you were playing a Fate game, these would be the things you would be tagging, because that's what makes a combat interesting. But so many scenarios, and I say this for World of Darkness as well, and all the other games I've worked on, quite honestly, are so bland for me when I get to location. But the summit in particular, I am very fond of tangents, as the time of this interview has shown, is very much based on High Rise, which is not my favorite J.G. Ballard novel, but is one of my favorite novels, and is a story about a tower block that goes increasingly insane, the inhabitants of which basically devolve into a weird hierarchical system where the lower floors are at war with the upper floors, and they're fighting for electricity, for power, for food, for an apartment. And because it's this deluxe high-rise, just brand new built, one floor is entirely things like hairdressers and banks and things like that. Another floor is entirely swimming pools and leisure facilities, but you also have apartments. And the summit, the Monarch complex in the summit, is pretty much the high rise from High Rise, and I've no shame about using that, because I think High Rise is a fantastic story, and more RPGs should be built in vertical dungeons.
I agree 100% to that, especially that last point. It's hard for me to kind of even narrow down what I want to ask you about Kult, because it's a great game. Did you play the early editions of Kult? I know Kult kind of...
Yeah, not much, I'll be honest, but I have played them. I never ran them, actually. I've got, you probably can't see them. So I've got them there. The previous editions of the game. And I really enjoyed the setting, just never really had a lengthy group. And most of the games I played in my formative role-playing years were always campaigns. Kult never really seemed to lend itself to campaigns, at least as far as my GMs were concerned. So the few times I got to play it were at conventions. But yeah, I really enjoyed Kult, again, for its setting, for its aesthetic, if not its rules. But yeah, I think Cult Divinity Lost, the new edition, is so beautiful in every way. I find the rules work absolutely perfectly for what I want. The art is sublime. There are few books that look as fantastic as Cult Divinity Lost in terms of layout and art. It's an acquired taste, because it truly is horrific in a very grisly, bloody way, and pornographic in parts. But if you don't mind that, or if you enjoy that from your horror, then Cult is definitely a game worth picking up. And I don't say that in a dismissive way. I think it's worth warning people, and I have been doing so with the Summit actual play videos as they've been coming out. It isn't World of Darkness. It's not Chronicles of Darkness. It isn't jump scare horror. The Summit and Cult Divinity Lost is very much horror that you have to sign up to. You have to be aware of your boundaries, what you're comfortable dealing with in a game, what you find fun, because it contains a lot that a lot of people aren't comfortable with. And that's fine. You don't have to enjoy it, and you can play it and file some of those serial numbers off so that you can play it in the way you want to play. But the game as written and the Summit as it's presented for the actual play are very much for minds who have certain, who can accept certain, I guess, scenes without finding them overly traumatizing, or traumatizing at all. I would say, for instance, the summit contains scenes of medical malpractice, child abduction, and body horror at the very minimum.
Absolutely.
So if any of those three do not appeal to your funny bone or horror bone, I would certainly steer clear of it.
That's a good way of putting it, and I've heard Kult described as the black metal of horror RPG, and I have personally described it as Clive Barker-esque. How do you recommend that people handle, the more extreme theme game like Kult, especially in a publicly accessible, like a podcast or an actual play on a Twitch channel?
So the podcast hosts should make it clear beforehand the content, and video games do it. I think a lot of movies do it. They certainly do in the UK, where it will give you a list of the kinds of things, like I just did with the 3 elements that are in Kult, for instance, and that allows people to come in and gauge for themselves whether they are comfortable dealing with those things. If I was to play it, communication. I mean, it sounds simple, but plenty of people don't make it clear the kinds of things you're going to be dealing with. You don't have to ruin any mystery. You don't have to spoil the ending. But if you have certain horrific elements in mind, and let's be clear, those elements might extend to such grisly topics as rape, child abuse, which tend to be up there as the I guess chief offenders often put into games for shock value, then your group has a right to know, because they may not want to deal with that kind of thing. And a decent GM, honestly, should be capable of tailoring their game to cater to the group. It isn't watering it down. It isn't diluting your game, essentially, by changing one thing to another, because it's a collaborative experience. Everyone should be able to enjoy it. Some people say to me, some people, naysayers, I guess, and we had this with V5 as well, when we put sensitivity guidelines, safety guidelines, and the like in there. They said, well, if you don't like it, you shouldn't be playing it. Or this is the world of darkness, you should expect this kind of thing. Well, different people have different levels of acceptability when it comes to horror. Some people enjoy different things. I enjoy The Shining, for example, but I saw Lars von Trier's Antichrist, and I had to take a break in the middle of that film because I found it so fucking awful to get through, and I wouldn't watch it again. And if I had known from the off what Antichrist was going to contain, I probably wouldn't have watched it at all.
Absolutely.
But and role-playing games should have the same thing, but the best thing about role-playing games is you can adjust them. It isn't like you're going into the cinema and your only option is to watch it or walk out. When you're playing a role-playing game, you can adjust things on the fly, and it shouldn't ruin anything. So yeah, I think best way to handle it is communication at the table, and if you're watching or listening to a, I guess, static medium like a podcast or a whatever movie, the people hosting or sharing it have a duty to actually brief the people, the prospective audience, what it might contain. To some, that acts as an appeal. You know, some people love the Hostel movies, some people love the Saw movies as examples. To some, that's a red flag, and they say, okay, won't go anywhere near that, and that's fine too.
Well said. Absolutely well said. And we agree. Our organization agrees 100%. It's a necessary conversation that should be had in any event.
Yeah.
One last question about Kult and then I think we will kind of move towards wrapping this fantastic interview. Again, thank you for your time. What is your favorite aspect of both writing for and playing or running like Cult, as opposed to the Darkness?
So I recently finished writing a scenario called "It Started and Ended with Screams" for Cult, and it's worse than the Summit. And I don't say that to brag. It's not a boast. Look at how disgusting I can be. It's an acknowledgement that this scenario, which is set in a center for troubled youths, is, in some parts, it's the perfect game for me to pour out any of my deepest fears and my most, I guess, the parts of horror that I'm most sensitive about. Where I wouldn't necessarily do that with something as, I guess, structured in a way as World of Darkness. World of Darkness has its own, it has a mythology, it has a hierarchy. You are playing within a very tight set of rules. Cult is quite the opposite. I think it allows you to be as gratuitous or as subtle as you want. And for me as a creative, and I always say it as a creative, I am a creative, and I should learn to accept that. It's very freeing to be able to write whatever is on my mind, get it off my chest. And so that allows a lot of emotional rawness to come out in a piece of cult work. And it allows me to really explore the depths and breadths of horror, where World of Darkness and Chronicles of Darkness are quite niche interests when it comes to those different kinds of playing supernaturals. I saw someone in the Twitch chat say different people play vampire for different reasons.
Yep.
And that's very true, but ultimately you're still playing a vampire. And I think that's more limiting than playing a human in a game like Cult, because when you're playing a human, you can innately relate to what that human is going through. So yeah, as a writer, it's certainly freeing, and it can be horror with the gloves off quite easily.
Absolutely. That's something that a lot of tabletop games in general, but particularly horror ones, can be missing in cases. And Cult does a beautiful job of that.
Yeah.
So onto a much brighter topic, because Cult can get dark. You mentioned before that one of the earliest games that you played and one of your favorites is Call of Cthulhu. Was that the first tabletop game you ever played?
No, the first tabletop game I ever played was Hercules and Xena: The Legendary Journey. It wasn't supposed to be. My first game was supposed to be a D&D, but I turned up on the wrong weekend.
That's amazing.
And so in the UK we have role-playing clubs quite often. In some countries that's mainly out of shops and people's houses. In the UK there's quite a lot of scout huts and village halls and things used for role-playing clubs.
Yep.
And someone at my college library told me about Dungeons and Dragons because I was looking up Baldur's Gate on a computer. And he said, come to this club on Sunday. We're playing a game of Dungeons and Dragons, Ruins of Myth Draenor. And we would love for you to, I'd love for you to come along. And so I came along, and it was the alternate week. It turned out D&D was running every other week, and on the other week it was Hercules and Xena: The Legendary Journey. So I got to play that as my very first role-playing game, and it wasn't very good.
I can imagine, although that sounds amazing as someone who grew up watching those shows and actually has action figures to them floating around his house, but we'll pretend I didn't just say that.
I think I just also want to say, was that a GURPS game? I don't think it was a GURPS game. It was D6s, but I don't think it was GURPS.
I'm gonna have to look that one up. What is your favorite? Is your favorite Call of Cthulhu? Just in terms of playing tabletop game.
Oh, that's a good question. What's my favorite game to play? I'm a rubbish player. I very rarely get to play,
I
so
I feel that pain. I am also the perpetual GM.
yeah, it's not a bad curse to have, honestly.
You
Um,
really get to play a lot more because of.
yeah. Well, look at all the characters you get to play when you're a GM. That's the thing.
Absolutely.
Um, my favorite game to play, I do love playing Call of Cthulhu, or I used to. I don't enjoy it so much now because almost every time I play Call of Cthulhu, the same scenario gets run, which is it's a one shot, and by the end of it, you're dead or mad.
Yep.
And when you first start role playing, that sounds like a novelty. It sounds, haha, this is fun. This is Call of Cthulhu. It's all about dying or going mad. And the first few times you play, that's so refreshing compared to Dungeons and Dragons with hit points and so on.
Yep.
But obviously, you have hit points in Cthulhu too. But when you just keep playing that same bloody scenario over and over again, it becomes quite tiresome. And that leads to me writing Call of Cthulhu scenarios that are really not like that or try not to be like that.
Absolutely.
So, one of my favorite games to play is Shadowrun, actually. I really enjoyed the setting for Shadowrun and Eclipse Phase. Eclipse Phase, which the second edition of which is currently being dispatched to backers, is a superb transhumanism sci-fi near future game, hard sci-fi, and it is brilliant, absolutely fantastic. I love Eclipse Phase. I love to run it. I love to play it. There's just so many options that you can delve into, both politically, philosophically, your morph, in other words, the physical form you take. And the world or the solar system in it has been so well thought out. I just love delving into Eclipse Phase. Again, I don't get to play it much, but when I do, I enjoy it every single time.
Interesting. But it's actually funny because I was just being told about Eclipse Phase. I've most of my gaming history has always been in horror games or dragons, and I've played Shadowrun very briefly. But someone was saying, "Oh, you should check out Eclipse Phase," so it's that one up.
It's interesting that Eclipse Phase is quite horrific in parts. It doesn't have to be, but yeah, my favorite game to play isn't a World of Darkness or Chronicles of Darkness game.
Yeah. I think it's funny too what you said about Call of Cthulhu. My feeling is there's only so many times as a keeper that I can have a bed fly across the room at someone that
Everyone runs that scenario.
I've ran
It's
it.
the one in the core book.
Yep, I've run it once and I went, this is fun. I'm gonna do something else.
I ended up playing through Shadows of Yog Sothoth about 3 times within
Ugh.
about 3 years with 3 different groups.
Yep.
Every single time I died in Scotland. And I ended up really developing a bit of a psychosis about the Scottish parts of Cannock, I think it's called, Shadows of Yog Sothoth, because I was determined the next time I play this, because there will be a next time, I will actually beat this scenario. I will know where to go. And the fact is, there isn't anywhere you can go
No, not that one.
to get a good ending. Someone's going to die, and inevitably it was me.
um, so you've worked a lot in games that other people have developed. You've dove into other people's lore and settings, but you did brainstorm and create your own game very recently. They came from beneath the sea, which is
Yes.
inspired by, correct me if I get the decade wrong, but 50s horror. Really that like golden era of B horror creature films.
Yeah, 1950s predominantly, maybe edging into the early 60s. But yes, it's mostly black and white, so occasionally with a dash of Technicolor. Um,
What inspired you to create this game? I am a huge fan of that era of film in particular, and so I love it. I think it's a fantastic setting for a game, but what kind of inspired you to create this one in particular?
So a few things, really. I mean, I've always loved that genre of movie. I love B movies in general. I love sci-fi. I love I guess, the heart that goes into 1950s sci-fi when
Yes.
sci-fi was really just taking off as a movie medium, to be honest. I love the allusions into real world politics that exist in these movies. Most of the time, it's either post Second World War grief coming through in these movies, or trauma, one should say, or it's the Red Scare. The idea of communists coming to invade or Soviets coming to invade, and so that just takes the form of aliens invading instead. The sheer number of scientists that appear in these movies, is, I think, interesting, because before the Second World War, scientists weren't anything to really base the plot around, unless it was Dr. Frankenstein. But come the nuclear bomb, everyone is a mad scientist.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, They Came From Beneath the Sea is... So, actually, here's an interesting thing. One of those key parts of They Came From Beneath the Sea in the system is this thing called quips. Quips are your pithy one-liners, your quotes that your characters will say that will either be caught on the trailer or on the poster, or they're just something your character's going to say over and over again, or might just say at an inappropriate moment. But the reason quips are in the game is because I initially came up with them when I was running a game called All Flesh Must Be Dark Place. Now,
Hold on a minute.
you may know All Flesh Must Be Eaten. You may know Garth Marenghi's Dark Place. Garth Marenghi's Dark Place was a 1980s parody hospital supernatural drama TV series. It's worth looking up, Garth Marenghi's Dark Place.
Yeah.
And the characters in Garth Marenghi's Dark Place have ridiculous dialogue. And for an Halloween one-shot, I decided to run for my gaming group All Flesh Must Be Dark Place, where it was a zombie apocalypse in Dark Place Hospital. And on the character sheets, where they were playing people like Rick Douglas, MD, and Lucian Sanchez, top surgeon, and things like that, they had quotes from the TV show. And if they could use the quote in an entertaining but perhaps not appropriate way during the course of the game, they'd get bonus dice or something like that.
Nice.
And that was about 10 years ago, and that stuck with me all the way through to developing They Came From and putting it in They Came From Beneath the Sea, because I thought this works well as a movie genre. And I wanted to really play with the idea of metagame, and the fact that a lot of people think metagaming is a dirty concept, a dirty word, and something you should move away from in role-playing games. But I wanted a game where metagaming is to be harnessed, and so there's a direct divide between players and characters, which is why you have cinematics that players can use. The characters will never know that this has happened. The cinematics are things like you can install a cheap set. So if the lobster men are about to snip your character's head off, you can use the cheap set to run through the wall, just knock through the wall and run through it. If Centipus is about to devour you and everyone else on your boat, and there's no way of beating Centipus, it's a 100-tentacled octopus, for Christ's sake, you can use Missing Reel, and the screen just cuts to black, and you reappear somewhere else. You can never refer directly to what happened in that missing scene, how you survived. You can make allusions to it. You might say something like, I've never seen someone do that with a coconut before, but you could never actually say how you escaped Centipus and got to this new location. Because for me, the idea of B movies is part of their charm is the holes in them, the problems with them, the wobbly sets, the bad acting, the awful one-liners, all of that stuff. And to put all of that into a game was something I really thought would be fun. And that's really the big driver for me with a game like They Came From Beneath the Sea, is I wanted to write a game that was fun at the tabletop, not horrific, not tragic. And I said this in a recent interview, but I think, at least when you start GMing, every GM is trying to elicit emotions out of their players.
Absolutely.
And it's very easy to elicit shock and horror, or well, at least shock through vulgarity, through crass gore and things like that. That's a very easy thing to make someone revolted. Just describe someone being disemboweled and the smell of it, and it would generally turn someone's stomach.
Yeah.
Now, other emotions are harder to elicit. So yeah, you can build fear up through suspense. Call of Cthulhu is very good for fear because you are fairly certain your character is going to die, but how?
Yes.
Dread is a very good game for building up suspense and fear. Now, the hardest emotions to elicit are arguably genuine joy and genuine anger. Sorrow falls somewhere in the middle there, because a game like Changing the Lost or Wraith the Oblivion is very good for making players feel bad because they can relate to death, they can relate to abduction. Anything that's relatable can make someone feel sad.
Absolutely.
But for you to feel genuine anger at something that's happening to your character, not anger at the GM, but anger because of the situation they're in, enough to get your adrenaline going, or genuine joy, yes, my character achieved this. Not yes, I rolled well, but wow, this is a fantastic time I am having at this table. I am having so much fun because of the story that's being told here. Is a different kind of challenge. And I wanted a game, and that's what They Came From, is where everyone around the table is very clearly having fun. And I found this when running at a convention and watching other people run it at conventions. People at other tables get pissed off by the They Came From players, because there'll be a table where everyone is just laughing and having fun and belting out stupid one-liners, but they love it and they walk away smiling because they've had a good time. And these people over here playing some other game aren't. They are there to accomplish a quest. That's not to say their method of play is wrong. Every method of play is fine. But my intention was to create a game that made people laugh and made people smile. And They Came From Beneath the Sea, I think, really accomplishes that. And it's through the medium of a movie genre that I'm a big fan of. So that's, I guess, 2 for 2.
Excellent. I love it. I think it's a fantastic game, and I know it needs to get more. There needs to be more voice behind it, in my opinion. We need more people playing it.
Yeah, well, if people are interested in that, They Came From Beneath the Sea is on Backit, and I cannot recommend enough that if you're watching this right now, at least back for the PDF. I am currently proofing the PDF, so it won't be long before it's released. So do get it now while you can. And if you do back They Came From Beneath the Sea on Backit, you can still get the traditionally printed version. I recommend it so that you don't go for a print-on-demand version. But it will be a brilliant game. So it's all written, all edited, all the art's in. It's just being laid out.
Awesome. Fantastic. All right. A little bit more about you and your history in gaming. What is your favorite experience in a game to date? Either playing or running.
God. That's actually a difficult one. My favorite experience. I've had so many. That's the thing. I suppose you don't really role play for as long as I have without having a lot of very good experiences. I guess in terms of accomplishment, the first time I improvised an entire dungeon was quite something. It's a story I told on my channel many, many years ago, where every single game I ran, whether it was D&D, Cthulhu, Pathfinder, Vampire, was written to the nth degree. I would have little boxes of dialogue in italics, just like you'd see in Dungeon Magazine or pre-written adventures, to tell me what I had to say, and they always went well, mostly. But I was running a game of Pathfinder, and I made the mistake of giving players a lot of choice. And it was Pathfinder set in the Forgotten Realms, a bunch of characters. The adventurers had scaled some mountains in the Cloud Peaks or some mountain range like that. And they were on a plateau that was surrounded by 5 wizards' towers. And they'd conquered the first one, which is the one I'd really pointed them towards. And they had 4 towers left. I think it was the Rotten Tower, the Crumbling Tower, the Bone Tower, and another tower. It was a long time ago. And they went for a tower I had not intended. Now, I could have quite easily just made it locked to them to point them in the right direction. But they were adamant that they were going to go in. I think I was expecting them to go back to the city to do things like cash in their magical artifacts and that kind of, to get healed up. But instead, they just wanted to get straight onto the next wizard's tower. They wanted to beat as many as they could. And they ended up going into the Bone Tower, which was a big necromancy tower. And I hadn't detailed anything beyond what it looked like from the outside and what the archmage who had built it was like as an individual when they were still around. And so the first person who went in got struck by a death spell over the door. And so they just died. And I was thinking that will be enough. And instead, they dispelled it, of course. And then they went into the tower. And one of them just started writing up a new character while the rest of the party was going in. Because they had no ability to raise dead. I don't think anyone was playing a cleric. Madness. But anyway, they went into this tower, and from that point, they scaled it from bottom to top in a 3.5-hour session. And because I hadn't detailed anything in advance, I had to improvise everything, every monster, every floor, every trap, every room, and I still wanted it to feel authentic. And the players didn't notice at all.
Nice.
And whether that says that my written work was really poor beforehand, or whether it says that my improvisation had unknowingly become really quite good, I don't know. But what it told me in the end was I don't need to do all of this prep in advance of games anymore. I still do some, but I can quite as easily make it up as I go along, and it can be entertaining. So yeah, that was a big moment of accomplishment for me. I think it was a very enjoyable time.
I actually would, interestingly enough, say much the same. I've always played, rewritten, or done heavy planning, and the first time it was probably a vampire game. Actually, I improvised a scene, like someone just, all my players are like, we really want to play this weekend. I was like, I am not prepared for that. I just went, all right, fine, cool, and did an improv scenario, and it was fantastic, and they had a ton of fun, and I had a ton of fun. I was like, oh,
yeah,
I'm gonna plan less. This might be an easier one for you to answer than, particularly because you have the same problem I have, which you are typically the game master. Favorite character that you have ever played?
That's another tricky one. It was probably not my acrobat from Hercules and Xena, the first character I ever played. It might be an elf I recently finished playing in Shadowrun. He was a Decker, and a Decker from Aztlan, so an Aztec. He had this sort of red face paint over the top half of his bald head, and very much brutal, nasty. And he was as fun as he was because of the players around him. We were supposed to, at the very start of the adventure, we were supposed to be delivering something. No, we were supposed to take someone out on some docks while they were making a deal. And what we ended up doing was taking everyone on the docks out, and we took the money for ourselves. What they were supposed to exchange, and we took everything with us, and it turned out to be more credits than we could really cash without being caught. So we decided to flee Seattle because it was always going to be set in Seattle. And so the GM was planning for us to go to Denver, I think, and we ended up going down to Vegas. So he had to improvise Vegas. So he ended up in the same position I was many years before. And because in my character's argument, what's the best place to wash, well, to rinse New Yen on a cred stick? Take it to Vegas. And so we went down to Vegas and committed some horrible crimes and performed various acts and various missions in an effort to get our money rinsed, and so that we could divide it between this party of 3 Shadowrunners. And it was very much like a Coen Brothers. It was quite Fargo-like because we started just everything was getting screwed up. Anything that could have gone wrong was going wrong, but still this money was intact. The cred stick was untouched. We were just jumping through all these hoops, serving organized crime, trying to put a fallen Don back on top of her family. And she said that once you do, you can basically use this cred stick in my casino, and we'll turn it as cash and that kind of thing. And we were just getting more and more at each other's throats. I remember we had to get this Don's lover out of a mental institution in the middle of the Nevada desert. And in order to get into there, we had to get past a retina scan. And my character ended up seducing a receptionist. I took her to a genuine restaurant that served genuine vegetables, which is quite something in Shadowrun.
Absolutely.
So she was charmed. And then when we got back to the hotel room, I cut her eyes out and sacrificed her to Tezcatlipoca or something like that. And the rest of the party at that point were, what the hell are you doing? Why are you doing this? So, well, we had to get her eyes for the retina scan. So, well, we thought you were charming her so that she would just let us in. So, no, I was charming her so that I could get her alone, so I could take her eyes. And my character was just not seeing the same thing they were, and the GM was appalled. But we ended up getting everything we needed. Ended up in the Don's penthouse above her casino, and it was at that point that the guns started coming out, and we ended up in the Mexican standoff over who was going to get the cash. And the end result was I was the person that first drew, shot our, I think, troll bodyguard or something like that, who was one of the other characters. I then shot the guy who drew first. I had spent all my luck or whatever it is in Shadowrun Moxie or something to avoid getting shot at all. I just sort of bent like the wind. I'd been saving it all up for an occasion like that. And I had the cred stick. The Don of the family said, you can take this and get the hell out of my casino. And my troll buddy, who got shot and was bleeding out on the ground, I could have helped him up, split the money with him, but instead I just put a bullet in his head and took all the money for myself. So it was quite a satisfying story in a very morbid kind of a way, but it was a character I really enjoyed playing, just very different to people I usually play.
Sounds like a classic Shadowrun.
Yeah.
Sorry. 2 more questions, 3 more actually, and then I just saw a question pop up in chat. I definitely want to ask, but in general, in your day-to-day life, what do you take that really informs the way that you develop games and how you write them
What do I take?
from your day-to-day life,
Oh,
from
okay.
your life outside of writing games and creating all these amazing?
So when I'm writing horror, many years ago, I used to be a suicide counselor, or more broadly, I was a student counselor online for American students, and most of them were going through suicidal feelings. The people that would call this number, they're very Samaritan-esque, and because for a while I was studying for a degree in health and social care. I was part of it. It was just something I never completed. It's not where my interests remained after a while. And I did that for about a year, this counseling over the phone, over Skype, really. And it was eye-opening, enlightening, and very traumatic. But at the same time, I've never taken someone's story wholesale, by no means, but it certainly opened up a raft of horror possibilities for me that are, again, relatable. In terms of my day-to-day today, I would say it's more the input of media, or my media consumption, whether that's my reading novels, which I don't get to do nearly enough of now, because if I'm writing all day, I don't tend to feel inclined to read afterwards. But
Absolutely.
at the same time, I acknowledge I never want to be in the position where I've written more books than I've read. But TV shows and video games, I know it's very simple, but the best way to stay creative is to constantly expose yourself to different media, even going out to things like galleries, taking a walk, going to a museum. I remember once I was in Rome and on holiday in Rome, and lots of piazzas everywhere, of course, piazzas with fountains in. And I remember being blown away by a fountain. It may have been in Piazza Nuovo, not sure, I could be wrong. There was a fountain that had been built hundreds of years ago. The statue in the middle of it was, I think there was a god, and lots of, and the streams, of course, from the fountain were pouring out over these shapes of snakes or serpents or something like that. And each of the serpents was representative of a river that had been discovered. It was supposed to be the 4 great rivers of the world. And this statue was built before America was discovered. So I think you had the Ganges, you had the Danube, and you had the Tiber, and there was another one, maybe the Nile. But I think at the time that it was built, it may have been the Ganges, the source of the Ganges had not been discovered, or the mouth of it hadn't been discovered. So this statue was telling a story of where on the map on this statue the river started and where it ended. And the same went for each of them. But for the river that hadn't been fully mapped, it was only half like a fountain spray. It didn't have the full depth, because at the time that it was completed, the artist, the sculptor, basically said, "We don't know, and we're going to portray that in this piece of art." And that for me was, I don't know, it was mind-blowing. That was only a couple of years ago I saw that, but I thought, wow, you could tell stories like that in RPGs just as easily. You can build that kind of thing into architecture, into the way people talk, the way myths and religions are born, when humans don't know all the answers. And you can get this out of any mystery TV show, or again, any historic piece of art. People fill in the blanks themselves. And I think that's always quite informative to my creative process.
That's very fascinating. That sounds like a very, very...
Yeah, I honestly can't remember what the name of it was, but I'm sure it's not too difficult to find.
Yeah, I'll have to dig into that one after this stream. So I want to give you a moment to tell us what we have to look forward to coming from your mind in the near future.
Horror, the horror. Thing I want people to look forward to the most. I know Mummy the Curse is currently on Kickstarter. Did anyone hear back while the stream was going on? Because if you did, remember I will sing to you before the stream is out. But the thing I want most people to look forward to is They Came From Beneath the Sea, because I've been developing a few stretch goals for it as well. The Heroic Land Dwellers, Tales of Aquatic Terror, and Monsters from the Deep. So you've got a playable story, you've got playable characters, and you have more and more monsters. I love a game with lots of monsters. And I just think it's such a different game for the market right now. There's not enough games that are purely about having fun. Paranoia is up there, obviously. That's a game like that. But otherwise, you have to very much shade your game of Dungeons and Dragons to make it about having a fun time. The Discworld RPG for GURPS, I guess, is another fun one. But yeah, there aren't many. Most of them try and cleave to a more adult genre, and I don't see why fun can't be adult, but most of the time you'll see sci-fi, horror, fantasy. Those are the big three, really.
Yeah. No, I agree, and that's one of the I'm looking forward to. They Came From me much.
Loriander, I would say back at PDF, and I will love you forever.
Yeah. PDFs ship for free. Peanut Boy did ask a question I want to drop in here before we close down for the evening, particularly for you. I know it's late there. Who is your favorite NPC from Chicago by Night?
Ooh, that's going to change from time to time. For a while, it was Adzi, who is the hidden proprietor of the Red Number 5. I like the Red Number 5 a lot because it's a new venue in Chicago by night. Obviously, Succubus Club is still there, renewed, revitalized. Blue Velvet's still there. But yeah, I'm a big fan of the Red Number 5, how it makes me feel about Harlem's Paradise in Luke Cage.
Luke Cage, yep.
Yeah. That's definitely what Red Number 5 has got going on for it. Yeah. It's and I find Avzi's story, his appearance, his slow manipulations, his autarky almost view of both Cameron and Anarch really appealing. Other than him, I am a big fan, and always have been, of the character of Horatio Ballard. It's one of the Ventru. He's not new for Chicago by Night, but his humanity's gone up a little. Not because he's more humane, just because having Humanity 1 and Humanity 0 vampires running around isn't as fun as it sounds.
No.
And I think it's the VTM 25 guys, Nate and Bob, who do a podcast as well, who really love Horatio Ballard as well. And I once left a voice message for one of them, which was Horatio Ballard by way of Wilson Fisk, to go back to Daredevil, where he's all, you can take a stab at my company, but you cannot take a stab at a Ballard. At which point he would just explode and just roil over you and batter you to death, because he's this completely respectable, albeit massive, businessman. But at the same time, he does have a very low humanity, and I think he could just crush someone to death if he wanted, with his fists or with his bulk, or in a car door if he really wanted to emulate Fisk.
Exactly. CT Phipps asked if you can give us any hints as to what the Chicago Folios have in store for the Anarchs.
Can I give any hints about what the Anarchs are going through? No. I probably can't, and that's not me being difficult. It's because I know what's coming out in what we're going to be releasing to backers with Chicago by Night soon, and I don't want to overextend myself, and neither do I want to spoil anything that will soon be revealed. I've already given you Al Capone. I gave you Capone. What else do you need? But there's plenty of plot hooks for the Anarchs to get involved in, plenty of new, interesting Anarch characters as well, which may, of course, test the limit of 10 that Prince Jackson has implied on the city.
Excellent.
Actually, you know what? I say Prince Jackson applied on the city. Everyone seems to assume Jackson applied it, and it's not that Genghis went to him and said, why don't I just suggest 10 that we can keep? And Jackson said, yeah, actually, you know what? That's a really good idea, Genghis. Thanks. You can make the list.
You should take responsibility.
Yeah, I prefer the idea that Genghis is just not, well, is either very cunning and has secured his own safety because he's on that list, or he just shot himself in the foot by saying, well, how about 10? Is 10 a good number? A bit like the La Sombra coming in and saying, I don't know, what do you want us to do? Sacrifice every elder? Yes.
That sounds like a great plan. Why don't you get on that?
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I know we went a little longer than we had originally planned, and I know it is late there. One last question, which actually comes from one of the Gehenna Gaming founders, Marchosius. AEW or WWE? Which do you prefer?
Well, I'm not really a big fan of either right now, and that's a shame because so I had very high hopes for AEW, as I think a lot of people did, and there was no real reason to. Every single company, when it first starts out, has a lot of problems when it starts finding its feet. AEW's main issue, and the reason I stopped watching, is because they don't have storylines for more than about 4 of their characters on screen. So I might as well just be watching something from Ring of Honor or some random wrestling match on YouTube if I want to just watch random wrestlers wrestle.
Right.
That's not why I watch wrestling. I watch wrestling for the storyline. So that should argue that I prefer WWE. But the main issue I have with WWE is they haven't really had a roster change in 5 years. If you look back through the 80s and 90s, pretty much every 3 years or so, there's a fairly big overhaul. There's a big injection of new talent, and old talent gets cut away. And that's not nice for the wrestlers, mind you, because they end up looking for jobs, or they end up having to become coaches or whatever.
Right.
But because Vince McMahon, the owner of the WWE, and this is just my guess into his insight, doesn't want to be releasing lots of free agents onto the market to give to his competitors. He just keeps the same wrestlers, and it just keeps getting built bigger and bigger and bigger. And some of their characters just aren't changing. Dolph Ziggler has been wrestling for the WWE now for 12 years, and he is still the same Dolph Ziggler. It may be longer than that. So NXT is, I guess, the best of both worlds because it's the lower level of WWE. It's more accessible to fans, or it was. But now that it's competing with AEW, it's what WWE are doing, are throwing all their major wrestlers onto NXT. So it stopped becoming NXT. I like the NXT invasion angle, but I don't want it to become a permanent fixture. So I don't know, Marchosius. I'm going to say WWE because I'm more likely to watch NXT than I am AEW at this time. If AEW starts creating stories for its characters, especially its women's division and tag team division, I will watch it again. But for as long as their ideas of characters are Orange Cassidy wrestling with his hands in his pockets and Joey Janela, fucking Jungle Boy or whatever. Not Jungle Boy. He's tolerable. Marco Stunt, jumping around. It's 4'9" wrestler. I have nothing against people with dwarfism. He doesn't have dwarfism. He's just about 16 years old and looks it. It completely takes me out of it. I want to feel a bit of immersion. I know it's stupid. I know it's fake. I know that it's choreographed or what have you. But I don't want to watch a 16-year-old fighting someone twice his height and weight, and for it to look like he's actually at all having an effect, because how can I take his opponent seriously going on from there? That's me being a role player. That's the problem. I put too much emphasis on character and believable motive. But there you go.
Excellent. One last question from the audience. Loriander asked, "Is the signed bookplate for Mummy signed by you?"
Yeah, I'll sign it. I believe I will probably be signing them at Midwinter Gaming Convention in Milwaukee in January, where I will be.
Good to know. Oh, there was a question earlier. Now I want to know because I will be there. Are you going to be at Gen Con this year?
Oh, so next year, next Gen Con,
Yes.
probably not. So to end on a rather miserable, miserable political note, I really have a problem with America.
I do too, so I can support that
Yeah.
position, and I live here.
No. I love a lot of Americans. I think there's a lot of fantastic Americans. But what I don't love is visiting a country where getting harassed by airport security is a given. Well, mostly it's not airport security so much. When you're doing the conveyor belt stuff and going through the X-ray, that tends to be fine for me. It's usually the checking your passport and asking your nature of business guys. That tends to be a bit unpleasant. The entire likelihood of being shot is never terribly appealing. I know I'm unlikely to because I'm both white and British, but that doesn't mean there's not going to be a sudden mass shooting where I happen to be, such as a games convention, which is a place full of people.
Yep.
It hasn't happened yet, but me being Mr. Morbid, I'm expecting it will. And the final thing is I ethically feel opposed to a country that keeps children in internment camps. So I will be going to Midwinter because it's a work obligation. I have to. Onyx Path have their summit at Midwinter in Milwaukee. But yeah, I really otherwise would prefer to go to a country that doesn't have those three issues.
Oh. fingers crossed that the political climate changes here quickly enough for you to want to come visit us again.
Yeah, you never know. It's 2020 next year, so fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I know it is late there. I will let you go quickly. Where can people find you online, and what would you like them to go look at?
They can find me on MatthewDawkins.com. And rather than asking anyone to back my Patreon, rather than asking anyone to send me money for a cup of tea, which they can do via my website, what I would really love it if you could do is please either check out Mummy the Curse on Kickstarter or They Came From Beneath the Sea on BackerKit. I don't get paid for you doing that. I just really want those books to do well. And secretly, they came from more than anything else because that was my idea. But if you can back either of those things, I will be incredibly grateful. Thank you so much. Oh, and did I see that Loriander has just pledged for Mummy?
Yep.
Okay. So let's think. Let's think of a song. Loriander. Loriander in my garden, oh so green. Loriander. Standing in my herbs like coriander so green. Loriander. I would hold you and I would kiss you. Loriander. We will dance away the night, oh Loriander. Dance away the night, or Loriander. See, it will get worse and worse. By sang. Now, let's think what else
Fantastic.
rhymes with Loriander. Loriander. Oh, you best not philander, Loriander. I appreciate your candor, Loriander. You really raised my dander, Loriander.
Fantastic. Excellent. Well, you heard it here. Mr. Matthew Dawkins serenading.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. In terms of Gehenna Gaming, we will be live again on Tuesday. I don't believe we are doing an interview this Tuesday, but we will be chatting about something gaming related. Stay tuned to find out. We will also be at PAX Unplugged running Vampire 5th Edition. So if you are going to be at Unplugged or in the Philly area, stop by and say hello. You can find us on Twitter at Gehenna Gaming. You can join our Discord, which I'll drop a link to in a second, or you can visit our website, www.gehennagaming.com, to see more of the fantastic things that we are working on. Again, I just dropped a bunch of links, so make sure you go check out Matthew Dawkins' work in all the places that you can find it, of which there are a plentitude. And we will see you again in the near future. Thank you all for tuning in. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Bye-bye.